you have the DVD you'd like to play?
Yeah.
Yeah? This one?
Yeah.
Make sure it's gonna work. So, I don't know if he showed you, but we have this drawer here.
Okay.
So you can keep TV remotes, microphone, stuff like
All
that
that in there.
in this
Okay.
drawer here.
And then lock it up.
This does lock, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. I know, we've got it going for you guys, so.
Thank you. What's your name?
My name's Fraser. Fraser.
Fraser?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was
Thank
the
you.
one who was working with Father Maurer on this.
Did you work downtown on Fraser? I did that Chancery building. We did that big Isaac Orr room, and we did the two big monitors and the sound system.
Which parish?
No, it was downtown at the Chancery central offices.
Oh, our guys probably did that.
I know it was Morgan, but I can't remember if you were there or not.
I don't think that was one of our projects, no.
Okay. They were outfit from Olympia, put in the original, and then they didn't want to drive up. So it was,
Yeah, CCI.
yeah, so then Charlie gave me a lecture on service with a smile after you put something in.
Right?
I said, you're hired. I don't even need to see your bid. Ever go in the room for it.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is my first time hearing the sound system, so. You mind if I just walk around here?
Oh, that's stay as long as you like. If you, a reflection of the light from the kitchen? No? That's good. Maybe the way it's got it tipped down.
Okay.
I was going to comment on that yesterday, that normally when it's over there and I'm trying to say read an opening prayer, there's a few places where it's glaring and I can't even read it. But here, there was no glare.
Oh, I'm glad. The Father's, see now, from where I'm standing, all I see is all those windows there, but from where you're sitting, those don't show up. I think his dream will be eventually be a flat panel, but this is more than adequate for shoreline.
Yep. Okay, enjoy it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fraser. Appreciate it. Okay, this is the final session. I decided to go ahead with it because they asked some really interesting questions, and it brings the expiration of St. Mark, at least as far as we went, a little bit, wraps it up. And like I said, I won't be here next week, and then the week after we're going to start Isaiah, so that kind of gives us some framing to it. We can see our opening prayer together, and it's on the front of this. I typed it on the second sheet where the closing prayer is, but we can read right off this front one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God,
who raised up St. Mark, your evangelist, and endowed him with the grace to preach the gospel, grant, we pray, that we may so profit from his teaching as to follow faithfully in the footsteps of Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen.
It says in this last session, final session, we will reflect on questions that have arisen during our journey through the Gospel of Mark. Let us keep in mind that Mark's style may be deceptively simple. We need to consider the deeper meaning of his prose in relation to the whole narrative of salvation history, looking through the lens of the Paschal mystery to understand Jesus Christ and what it means to be his disciple. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 points. And when I saw that, I thought, I'm not going to transcribe that. I just ran it right through. So I'm not going to read each one, but maybe we can talk about that at the end. If not time for figs, why does Jesus curse the fig tree? Mark's use of the way, they kept talking about the way, a destination or a journey. 3, is there a cosmic relationship between destruction of the temple and the end of the world? And they talked about some of those end of the world predictions were actually Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple and not the end times. Number 4, what is the symbolism of Peter's words denying Christ? Number 5, how is Mother Teresa's feeling of abandonment related to Psalm 22? Number 6 is compared with other Gospels. What does Mark say about women disciples? I don't remember discussing that. 7, disciples panic in the storm at sea. I remember that in that picture. Was it Rembrandt? Who pictured himself in the boat, painted himself in the boat?
I know Caravaggio did a lot of that
Yeah.
work.
There was an extra guy in the boat, and here was the artist looking right out at us. Number 8, is there an allusion to the book of Daniel in accusation that Jesus will rebuild the temple in 3 days? Number 9, what are the implications of Christ's dual nature, especially as seen in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane? And number 10, finally, what is learned by Mark's details on Peter's denial? Now, those may be the questions that he's fielding. I looked at part of it when I was answering email at the same time, so we'll find out. See what we can learn here.
Father Mulholland liked the artwork to correlate the Gospels and stories, the parables.
Welcome. I wanted you to be able to join us for our question and answer time in light of our series on the Gospel of Mark. And so now I want to just be able to take some questions that have arisen, that you reflected on during our study of Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel, of course, moves quickly, right? There's immediately. And there's a kind of a breathless pace. And I think sometimes I was moving immediately, and maybe I moved too fast at certain areas and places where you want to fill in. So feel free to ask any questions you have. Yes?
So in chapter 11, when Jesus curses the fig tree, it says that it wasn't the season for figs. So why is he upset to not find any figs if it wasn't the season for figs?
Great question. A lot of people have that question. So why does, in chapter 11 of Mark, why does he, when he goes up to this fig tree looking for figs because he's hungry, and he curses it because he finds no fruit, but then Mark tells us that wasn't the season of figs. Because it's Passover, it's early spring, right? So it seems a bit unreasonable. And so that tells us that there's something deeper and symbolic going on. And so Jesus is looking from the fig tree for fruit. And of course, the fig tree was a symbol for Israel. So in the prophet Hosea, for example, Hosea 9, he refers to Israel as a fig tree. So I think part of what's going on there in Hosea 9, verse 10 and following, Israel is imaged as a fig tree, and Jesus is coming to Israel looking for fruit, but he's not finding it, right? And he kind of plays on that a little bit further. He's already thinking of the idea of looking for fruit. He plays on that just a little bit later in chapter 12, where he talks about a vineyard, and the son who's sent to get the fruit, but the tenants chase him off and ultimately kill him, and he can't get the fruit. So this idea of coming and searching for fruit. Now, in Isaiah chapter 5, which Jesus is referring to in that story of the vineyard, in Isaiah 5, God plants Judah and Israel as his vineyard. And he looks for the fruit, which is righteousness and justice. And they don't produce those fruits. So the idea of him looking for fruit is, in a sense, he's symbolically, it's kind of a bit of an allegory that he's looking for the fruit of fidelity and righteousness and justice from Israel. But instead of justice, he sees the temple as a den of thieves. And then, of course, the fig tree will become the symbol also of the fate of the temple. Because the curse of the fig tree and then the withering of the fig tree, sandwiched in between there, is that the temple is a den of thieves. Right? And, of course, the den of thieves, the idea of stealing, which again goes back to the parable of the vineyard, the wicked tenants, which also goes back to Isaiah 5, where God's looking for good fruit and he doesn't get it. So I think all those things kind of fall in the background. But again, it just brings out that when something doesn't seem to make sense, or something seems very simple in the gospel story, there's usually a deeper meaning behind it. And that deeper meaning, I think, always goes back to the story of Israel. It's that connection between Jesus and Israel. That becomes the key to making sense of these things. Right? So great question. Seemed a bit unfair. That poor fig tree, right? You guys are all like, that poor fig tree. Right? But it was a prophetic action. And I think part of what we have to see here is prophets were known for doing prophetic actions, which means something very symbolic. Ezekiel shaves his beard, and that signifies losing honor and dignity. And then he cuts it up, and that signifies the fate of Jerusalem is going to get slaughtered by the Babylonians. You know, another time, the prophet Isaiah has to run around naked. He's prophesying the spoiling of the city and of Israel. And so the idea of these prophetic actions have symbolic meaning beyond the literal. And Jesus overturning the money changers' tables signifies the overturning and destruction of the temple. Or the cursing of the fig tree would be another symbol of that. You know, for Jeremiah, he takes a clay vessel and he throws it against the wall. And he says that's what's going to happen to the temple. The shattering of the clay vessel signifies the destruction of the temple in Jeremiah's day. So these actions that are symbolic are kind of prophetic actions. Prophets are constantly doing parabolic deeds, so to speak. Other questions? Yes?
So you spoke many times that Mark emphasizes a lot of the way. I was wondering if you could speak more on how much of that is a way to something, a destination, and how much of that is the journey itself, and especially in light of the entire scriptures.
Great question. So when Mark talks a lot about the way, is it just simply a destination or is it a means? Is it an end or a means? Is it the process, is it the journey, or is it the goal? And I think for Mark it has a sense of both. So of course taking up from Exodus 23 that he does, verse 20, the idea is the Exodus way, the way to the promised land. So it's a journey, and it's a journey that the people at that time are afraid to make, and so God's going to lead them himself. So the promise of the way is that the Lord will lead the way. Right? That's the key promise. Now, ultimately, the way ends in the promised land for Israel. And of course, ultimately, it will lead to the new promised land, which is heaven. That's the ultimate destination. Now, Jesus' way, as Mark will depict it, is going to be the way, Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross. But Jesus, by taking the lead in this way, is again, the people of Israel were afraid to go into the wilderness. They were runaway slaves from Egypt. They were paralyzed by this newfound freedom. They didn't know where to go and what to do. And God says, follow me. And so God's glory cloud led them in those 40 years in the wilderness and led them to the promised land. Jesus is going to be the Lord who will lead Israel and his 12 apostles. He will lead us on the way. And that way ultimately intensifies in that central part of Mark, called the, on the way, which Jesus is announcing his passion predictions. And so that way now gets zoom lensed in, and it's the way of the cross. But that way, which ends with Jesus' death, doesn't end with his death, it ends with his vindication and resurrection. Right? And so I think that's the idea. And the good news is, Jesus leads the way for us. He goes through death and out the other side to give you and I hope and faith that we too and our loved ones can go through death and out the other side to the true promised land of heaven. Yes?
Is there a cosmic relationship between the destruction of the temple and the end of the world?
Yeah, great question. What is that relationship of the destruction of the temple that Jesus foretells in Mark 13 and the end of the world? And I mentioned that a little bit. St. Augustine had a great insight on this, and I think people like Father Alfred Lauzzi would have profited if they would have read Augustine, but they were so busy into Greek and archaeology and all the new stuff that they forgot the old stuff, the old studies. But there's a danger in that in biblical studies, to forget what the tradition and the church had reflected on earlier, because there's insights that can become lost. And I think this is a good example. Father Alfred Lauzzi losing the wisdom of the tradition. Augustine made this observation in the City of God. He said, when you read Mark 13, or the eschatological discourse, it's very hard to know when Jesus is referring to the end of the temple and when he's referring to the end of the world. So it gets confusing. So even for a guy like Augustine who's brilliant, it's like that. It does kind of get confusing. So how do you adjudicate that? How do you navigate the end of the world and the end of the temple? Well, the way I wanted to paint it for you is that Jesus himself wasn't expecting the end of space and time within a generation. I want to focus on the idea that Jesus was focusing on the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem, which prophetically was fulfilled 40 years later, in 70 AD. But, think of it this way. Jesus comes at the end of the Old Covenant, and the Old Covenant is with one nation, Israel. And at the end of the Old Covenant, he comes looking for fruits, as we spoke of before. And he doesn't find it, and there's a judgment. And the city and the temple will be destroyed. But Jesus is going to have a second coming. In the second coming, he will come at the end of the New Covenant. And the New Covenant is with all nations and all peoples. But at the end of the New Covenant, Jesus will come, and he will come looking for the fruit. And if he doesn't find it, there will be a judgment. That will be the final judgment at the end of the world, as it's described in other places in the Scriptures. And so what happened to Jerusalem and Israel at the end of the Old Covenant and that judgment that we hear about in Mark 13, all the signs leading up to the destruction of the temple, all the judgment that happens then, is a prefigurement of what will happen at the end of the world. When Jesus comes the second time and he judges the New Covenant, and this time he'll judge all nations. Because all nations were given the opportunity to know and believe and to bear fruits of righteousness. And so in a sense, that's why Augustine said, it's hard to know what's Jerusalem in 70 AD and what's the end of the world, because the destruction of Jerusalem is a sign and a prefigurement of the world. And that's why even the temple itself was a microcosm of the cosmos. Philo, as well as Josephus, described that the temple had the altar, which represented the land, and the candelabra above it was the 7 great lights, which was the 5 known planets and the sun and the moon. And so the destruction of the temple was, and of course the temple veil looked like the constellations. So the destruction of the temple is a prefigurement of the destruction of the world. So think of it this way. I like to think of it kind of 3 aftershocks. The first great day of the Lord, the judgment, happens to Jesus first. His death, he's the true temple, his death on the cross then sends an aftershock that will lead to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which then sends an aftershock that will lead to the destruction of the world 2,000 plus years later. Right? So there's I think a chain reaction, so to speak, in that symbolism. So it's a rich symbolism, but I think that there's a lot there. So the idea that there'll be false messiahs and tribulations and other things that will happen that will heat up and intensify until the second coming I think that's the way to read Mark 13. Yes?
You identified in Mark's a lot of actions in words that were symbolic with a lot of different things. With Peter's words, I do not know him. Do you see some symbolisms there?
Yeah, you know, as we're learning from the Gospel of Mark, all these words and deeds are just full of meaning, right? And of course, Peter's denial, I do not know him. That itself is highly symbolic, because to know in Hebrew, yada, means to be in covenant. And so when he says he doesn't know him, he's actually cutting himself off from a covenant relationship by that denial. Now, God in his mercy will restore Peter, and we know from the Gospel of John that after the resurrection, up in Galilee, Jesus will be sitting by the shoreline in chapter 21 with a charcoal fire. And Peter and some of the boys are in the boat. And then Peter hears it's the Lord. He dives in, swims to the shore, but there's only 2 times you have a charcoal fire in the Gospel of John. And at the shore, and where Peter denied him 3 times in John 18 at that fire. And then, of course, Jesus will ask Peter 3 times, do you love me, Peter? Do you love me, Peter? Do you love me, Peter? He gives him a 3-fold opportunity to undo the 3-fold denial, which is just extraordinarily beautiful when you see that connection. Other questions? Thoughts? Yes?
In the book, Come Be My Light, which is the book of letters by Mother Teresa,
Mm-hmm.
she experiences a great darkness and a feeling of abandonment by God for over 40 years. And she likens it to those first lines in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And she, relates to that in Christ's life.
Right. Yeah, no, that's it's a great connection. So Mother Teresa of Calcutta, of course, suffered what we know now from her letters to her spiritual directors, this great darkness, this great desolation, when St. John of the Cross talks about the dark night of the soul, right? And so she feels that God has abandoned her, and she feels that abandonment, and she speaks about identifying with that line of Jesus from Psalm 22, verse 1, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I think I've got 2 ways to explain that. The first way is that Mother feels abandoned, just as Jesus feels physically abandoned. When you're being crucified and abandoned by everybody, you feel abandoned. That doesn't mean you think that you're abandoned. And so Jesus feels the abandonment of God, but he knows that he's not. And of course, he knows the ending of Psalm 22, even though he's living the first half of Psalm 22 at that point, right? So he knows where the story ends. And so he doesn't think God has abandoned him utterly. Right? And now, I think another insight about Mother on this, and I remember talking to one of the sisters who was very close to Mother. She had Mother as a principal. She's one of the first Missions and Charity Sisters. And I've gotten to know her, and she's a dear friend, and she's been a prayer warrior for me over the last decade. And I remember talking to her when this came out. We were in Harlem, and I was doing a retreat for the Missions and Charity Sisters. And she had a great insight into that darkness of Mother. She said that Mother, at the beginning of her ministry, wanted to identify so much with the poor that she really had a rule where they would live with the poor, they would beg, and she didn't want to be above the poor, to go down and serve the poor and then go back to a nice place, right? She wanted the sisters to live with the poor. That's why, when they were, I remember the story when they were going to San Francisco, she wanted the water heater cut off, and she didn't want hot water. That would not be the way you would live with the poor. The poor don't have hot water. And they were going to give them code for the retreat house of the Missions and Charity Sisters in San Francisco. And I said, well, then we'll leave. And I said, okay, we'll make an exception. But here's the beautiful thing that this sister said about Mother. And she gave Mother's eulogy at her funeral. And she said this. She said, Mother wanted to identify with the poor so much that she didn't want to simply identify with their poverty in terms of the poverty of food, the poverty of having hot water, the poverty of a nice bed. Because, it wasn't just that poverty. She wanted to experience the ultimate poverty of the poor in spirit. The poor who don't know God, who don't feel the consolation of knowing Jesus Christ and his love. And so she took on the suffering of the poor, even in that poverty of spiritual poverty. And that's what Jesus made her feel. so that she could carry that like Jesus carried the sufferings for our sake, so that the good news could go out to the poor, and many of them could know the gospel and know the consolation of God's love. She lived without that. In fact, she lived in the absence of that because she was carrying that cross for the sake of the poor. I think that's a beautiful insight into, again, prophetically, a prophet embodies the message, and Mother embodied that the poorest of the poor, the poverty of the poor. And so she embodies that sense of feeling that she was abandoned, even though she knew she wasn't, that God loved her, but she didn't feel it. And that was a desolation. And that's part of what St. John of the Cross talks about in the dark night of the soul. That in the dark night of the soul you can feel desolation. You can feel that God is very far from you, even if you know in the scriptures and by God's promise that God hasn't abandoned you. You may feel it. And there's a difference between feeling and doubting. As John Cardinal Henry Newman said, 1,000 difficulties don't equal doubt. We can't give in to doubt. So she didn't doubt God's love or God's presence, but she didn't feel it. And that was part of her Christ bearing. She was taking on the mission of Christ, bearing the suffering of the people. It's straight to that, but I think that's the right angle. And I think when I think of Sister Teresa, who shared that insight of her mother, I found a lot of insight in that. Other questions? Yes?
I was wondering if Mark sheds any more light, maybe, or different light than the other Gospels, about the women that were ministering to Jesus. And just wondering if there's any traditions or any other information about them that we can find in Mark.
Yeah, that's a great question. What does Mark have to say about the women disciples? And, it's interesting.
I said on something.
Just poor connection.
Empty. No. Ready? Because it was the setback.
You might have to clean off the DVD.
And a bra. And abrupt. So that sense of wanting to honor Jesus, to care for him, the courage, to go there, the vigilance, we see all that. And they are the first eyewitnesses. Now, of course, in the ancient world, women weren't seen as reliable eyewitnesses. And one of the beautiful things about Christianity is they rely on the witness of the women at the empty tomb. And that's remarkable. And so Mark is faithful to that, and he's abrupt. He stops right there. He doesn't give you the other stories that you'll get in some of the other Gospels of other people who then go to the empty tomb later on, when Peter and John run to the tomb and find it empty after they hear from the women, right? So it's a strong sense of that. But Mark is moving so fast, he's so action-packed, the gospel that really opens up the importance of a lot of the women who are disciples of Jesus is the Gospel of Luke. It's Luke in particular who does that. And by the way, remember I told you that at the framing of Mark's Gospel is Peter's eyewitness testimony. He's the first one named and the last one named, which means he's the eyewitness testimony. So in the ancient world for the Greeks, remember, we said that if you got your testimony from an eyewitness, you would name that eyewitness at the beginning and end. Well, in Luke's Gospel, he names women at key points who are eyewitnesses for his testimony. And the center of Luke's Gospel is unique to Luke. And at that center, in Luke chapter 8, he names several women who were following Jesus, and he names them again at the end of the story of Luke. And those women who are giving eyewitness testimony to Luke, all of a sudden, in that section, you find Jesus interacting with women in very important and significant ways that don't get mentioned near as much as in the other Gospels. So Luke is the best window into that. He interviewed Our Lady, and so he gives us a window into Mary, and he also interviewed Susanna and Mary and others. So Luke is the best Gospel for that. So we'll have to do a lecture on Luke. Yes?
I wonder if you could comment on Mark 4:38, the storm in the Sea of Galilee, and the irony of the disciples saying, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" in light of John 3:16.
Yeah, exactly. When you look at that story at the end of Mark chapter 4, and they wake up Jesus by saying, "Teacher, do you not care that we perish?" Of course, Jesus does care a lot, which is why he's there. As John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that they may not perish but have life, eternal. And so of course Jesus cares, and there is a great irony. Again, it gives you this sense of misunderstanding that they have. They think he doesn't care, and it's like he wouldn't be there if he didn't. As we're going to see for the rest of the story, "Teacher, do you not care that we perish?" And I like that he must have been tempted to rebuke them, but he actually awoke and rebuked the wind and the waves instead. So Jesus had good self-control. Other questions?
Is there an allusion to Daniel when Jesus is accused of saying, "I will rebuild the temple in 3 days, but it will be not with human hands"?
Yeah, there is so a good question. So the question is there an allusion to the book of Daniel with Jesus during trial, put on trial, and someone says, I've heard him say that I will destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build another not made by human hands. And that comes back.
Come on, we're not gonna make it.
Where there's an cut.
10 more minutes, is all we gotta get through.
And what's significant about that stone is that, juxtaposed to that, Daniel sees a vision of a statue with 4 different metals. And that statue represents 4 kingdoms: the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians, and then the Greeks, and then ultimately the Romans, who will conquer and rule over Israel. And opposed to that statue is represents the king. And
It's a brand new DVD, we just took it out of the box last week.
you should,
Yep, yep, yep. All right, well, that's enough. We'll answer our own questions.
Can we start at the beginning? The first one with the fig tree?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's various theories on that. One again from this is Venerable Bede as well as John Chrysostom commenting on this, that first you have the fig tree, then he goes into the temple. And, you know, in both actions, he's prior to this, Christ heals people. People bring their problems to him and he solves them. He's showing no violence against anybody. But he's showing now that he can. You know, first with a fig tree, and then cleaning out the things that in the temple that are unjust. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way, with myself, again, this is my own. I don't know anything about fig trees, but I do know things about plum trees, apple trees, and cherries, and so forth. That in the spring of the year you're going to get a blossom, and that's going to tell you whether or not really you're going to bear fruit. So he may have seen that there are no blossoms here.
Fig trees don't make blossoms.
The what now?
Fig trees don't make blossoms.
Well, okay, I didn't know that. Okay, so forget about that.
That's actually a great image, but it just doesn't fit. To see the science.
Well, there might have been something that,
But what does it mean if he says it is not time for figs? So they put their leaves out first, and that was the significance of the Pharisees. They dressed in impeccable clothes, and their houses had many of the ritual bathing pools. So they stuck to the letter of the law, but then they intervened between God and the people,
Yeah,
and that's why they were dead
forgot to
fighters.
clean the inside of the vessel.
Mhm.
Well, anyway, like I say, in St. Thomas's Aquinas book here, it just basically, Christ came to the fig tree, and it was cursed because he found no fruit upon it, for it goes on, and when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. For the time of the figs was not yet, and Jesus answered and said to them, no man eat fruit of the hereafter forever. He therefore curses the fig tree for his disciples' sake, that they might have faith in him, for everywhere distributed blessings and punished no one, yet at the same time it was right to give them a proof of his chastising power, that they might learn that he could even cause the persecuting Jews to wither away.
Mm.
So that, and that, yeah, he's quoting St. Chrysostom on this. So that's, and then, of course, then the next act is the cleansing of the temple. Again, another scene of violence, shall we say. That Christ is both merciful and gives blessings, but he's also can be firm when it comes to justice.
So also he had a righteous anger,
Yes.
because he was taking care of the people who were being prevented,
Yeah, and then also,
thwarted.
again, prior to this, for several centuries, this was not, the leadership in the temple was not the one from Aaron, but other people actually were actually paying their way to become leaders in the temple. And the Greeks, had brought in all sorts of pagan symbols and everything else. So there are many people, like the Essenes, that would have nothing to do with what goes on in the temple.
Mm.
So Herod was rebuilding the temple.
Yes.
What tribe was he from?
He was not, I don't think he was a Jew at all. He was, he was representing the Jews,
Okay.
but he's, I think, from the line of Esau over there.
Oh, really?
What, I can't remember the area. I mean, he
Yeah,
yeah, on Herod, he's not going to come from one of the 12 tribes. I can't remember the name of the,
let's see. Herod the Great was the one that massacred the innocents, and Herod Antipas was the Tetrarch of Galilee through Jesus' life.
well, again, I think he was appointed, and there's probably some changing of money for him to be in charge. But also, you remember at that time, the Ark of the Covenant was not there.
So why did Herod want to rebuild the temple?
Again, I think it was to try to, because personally, he was not a Jew himself, but by rebuilding this, of course, he's going to gain great faith or great
Favor.
favor, yes, among the people.
grandfather were educated in Rome, so they were kind of nominally visualized, but they were raised that way.
So he could have been on the east.
Yeah, something like that. They were all obviously a wealthy family.
There's so many considered here. Jacob's family.
So Jesus kind of went out on a limb to curse the fig tree, to show us, and to show the Pharisees, they are a den of vipers, and they harassed him for that 3 years. Why do you do this, and why do you do that, and bringing the woman to have her stoned. And wrote in the sand, possibly their sins and their involvement with the woman.
Yeah, well, again, I think that victory is symbolic of the Israel people.
It is, it's used as a symbol of Israel, and then frames, he curses, then cleans the temple, and then when he comes out, they see that his curse is fulfilled. So what they had said earlier was that lends credence to his prediction: if you tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And he's referring to his resurrection, and then that whole idea of the resurrection is given credence by the fact that he cursed the fig tree, and then after the cleansing of the temple, they come out and see it's withered up.
Well, I think also prefigures what's going to happen in 70 AD with the complete destruction of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, this is sort of like a warning, prefigurement of doom for a lot of people.
Well, I'm sorry we didn't make it to the end there. We had a few more questions on the allusion to the book of Daniel.
In the book of Daniel, it represented those kingdoms that had, when Israel had disobeyed God, then God allowed them, the Persians and the Romans in the end, to punish them. But then God's mercy was always there to rescue the Israelites.
I believe a stone, or you could say a rock,
A pebble.
like Peter, a Petrine, hit the clay feet,
And the
and the whole thing tumbled
collapsed.
on over. So I think that's, to me, in a later day looking at it, is that the Christian church is going to be supplanting the Roman Empire.
Mhm.
That you have all these kingdoms built up, but it's going to take this little stone, this little pebble. Again, I think that signifies Peter and the
I think
church.
it's Jesus is the pebble.
Well, it comes from, I think it comes to heaven or something like that. But usually when you think of a rock or a stone, to me, I think of Peter, because anyone's going to strike it at the clay feet, a weak part, and the whole, all these temples, all of these ways of life, of hierarchy, and slavery and conquest, and all these things are going to come crashing down.
Well, it's interesting that he made the Romans, the clay and the iron,
Yes.
because it was the Romans that made the path for the incarnation, so that Jesus gospel.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's evident in the biography of St. Paul. It seems like he's wandering randomly around Asia and Eastern Europe, and really he's following the Roman supply roads.
Right.
So it's major stop points on the Roman supply roads, which I would have never understood that.
And then he went back and checked on him and saw how they were doing.
It supplies in mail and so forth, and, Romans built things straight. Easy to follow on the roads,
And he knew how to make bridges.
yes,
Mhm.
but they would, level things out.
Mhm. But yet they were no better than clay and iron.
Yeah, because it's that, what faith you have. And now, at the beginning of Mark, that's the whole question of who is Christ, the Son of God. Now, at that time, the Romans believed that it was the emperor, the Caesar, was the Son of God. So we have two competing philosophies of life here, and it's going to be Rome that's going to fall.
But also every leader that came along, they started being declared the Son of God anyways. So
Oh,
how many have actually had themselves declared a Son of God?
Superhero.
oh, Cyrus was anointed.
That was interesting. Daniel predicted that. Isaiah predicted Cyrus
And by name.
came from Persia and restored Jerusalem. We'll get to that when we look at Isaiah.
So the DVD went out, question 6, talking about the women disciples. So we can go to question 7. Well, he did also talk about the storm at sea. There's the book of Daniel. How about question 9? What are the implications of Christ's dual nature, especially as seen in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane?
Fully human and fully divine, if you can imagine the agony of his divine mind, divine nature, knowing how it's going to end, but still realizing that his human nature's got to go through this intense suffering to get there.
So even through the Last Supper, he's not bearing our sins, knowing that how ugly it is to God the Father.
And then still submits to the Father's will, not my will, but yours be done.
The other, many days ago, Fulton Sheen on the radio on Sacred Heart Radio gave a lecture on this topic where, all right, if God is coming to this world, what would you expect? Well, obviously to be foretold, and and then so forth, many other things. All right, so basically Christ fulfills all these things about being foretold and how he will be able to heal people and everything that. But you compare this to Christ to any other religion, and they all fall short. There's nobody that has fulfilled what you would think God would do if he came down to how would we recognize him? With his ability and teaching how he would act and what he would do. And even dying for us because he loved us so much. And so that's kind of the implications of his dual nature, that he would do all these things that he did while on earth here.
Come to the nation of Israel, which I think is the only culture in history that had one God, monotheism, which is just a completely unknown idea anywhere in the world,
Right.
anywhere up to that point. So to have the Son of God come to the culture that recognizes one a personal God, has a name that we can enter into a relationship with.
So
And then,
the Greeks and all those, they had scales on their eyes.
yeah, I mean, they
Egyptians
were
were-
reaching after it. It was a shadow of truth, but it wasn't the full truth. And that's instinct to make sacrifice and offer something to God and make holy. But it was never brought to fulfillment until Christ.
So even back with Socrates and Aristotle, they looked at the gods, and they looked at the attributes of the gods, and they decided what was justice. So what is good? When you take care of your poor, you take care of your fellow man.
Yeah, well, and Plato talked about an essence of truth that existed, but it didn't have a name. It wasn't a personal God to have a relationship to. And that actually attracted Augustine, that idea of, was the Neoplatonists that were pointing the way to Christ for him, with that idea of personification of truth. So,
Prior to the Garden of Gethsemane, and celebrating the Passover, it was when Jesus told them that when you dip the morsel, that's when Satan entered the picture. Entered the whole picture. That was when it was all going to come to fulfillment.
well, or entered Judas anyway, but I think
But still.
because he made reference to Satan in his teachings before that,
But we don't relate Satan with the Pharisees or.
no. To set in motion the actions of the passion,
So that
Judas was driven by Satan.
Jesus would
But
overcome
he
death.
already made arrangements, had he made arrangements before the dinner or not with the Pharisees, with the priests?
Oh, you mean?
Sounds like he went out.
Before the dinner even, had he
Yes.
already made
Did he, or
arrangements?
did he go out to?
Yeah, he already had the 30 coins.
Then he went to stop it and it was delayed and he threw the coins.
No, he didn't get to stop it until Jesus had gone before the high priest.
Oh, at one point, when he tried to, and that's actually.
And he saw that they beat Jesus. That
Let's
he
see
caught
what
the
it
face
says.
with a stick. I guess that seems not like in Mark where he goes before the high priest. And the high priest sort of strikes Jesus across the face with his big club. And Jesus says, "You know who I am. Why are you doing this?"
Yeah. Now this says Judas went off to the chief priests to hand him over. When they heard him, they were pleased and promised to pay him money. Then he looked for an opportunity to hand him over. Then, the next paragraph is preparations for the Passover. Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? They showed him the room. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and as they reclined at table, Jesus said, "Amen, I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed and say to him one by one, "Surely it is not I." One of the 12, one who dips with me into the dish.
well, he hasn't given the morsel to Judas yet.
That must be among the other, I wonder if that's in Matthew.
It's Matthew who's actually there. In John.
In Matthew, it says it would be better for that man if he'd never been born. Judas, his betrayer, said in reply, surely it is not I, Rabbi. And he answered and said, you have said so. Woe to them, this is Luke, woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. And they began to debate about themselves. Who among them would do such a deed? Oh, it's the Gospel of John. Jesus answered, it's the one to whom I hand the morsel after I dipped it. So he dipped the morsel, took it, handed it to Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot. After he took the morsel, Satan entered him. So Jesus said to him, what you're going to do quickly. Now, none of those reclining at table realized why he had said this to him. Some thought it was since Judas kept the money bag, Jesus had told him, buy what we need for the feast or give something to the poor. So he took the morsel and left at once. So that's from
So
the
they were not
Gospel of
on-
John.
They were not on alert. He had
No,
said
not
one of you
yet.
was going to betray me, and then their minds went somewhere else. He dipped the morsel and gave it, and
Off we went.
I think all this made sense to them later.
Afterwards, yeah.
And they start referring to him as the betrayer and all that in the writings. They didn't do that before. He was just one of the 12 to that point. And later on, when they talk about him, he's always the betrayer.
I suppose a certain amount relied on the coming of the Holy Spirit, open up their minds and hearts.
Yeah, prior to Pentecost, they were rather secretive. They were hidden. They were not going out and converting anybody. They didn't really start going until, Christ breathed on them, gave them the Holy Spirit. Then, and only then, they go out and preach the gospel.
Yeah, literally and enabling, they gain courage and strength and the final question, what is learned by Mark's details on Peter's denial? It says Peter was humble and honest about his failings, and God uses Peter's failings to display the wideness of God's love and mercy to his flock. And we talked about Peter's impetuousness, jumping into the sea, before he thinks. But God used that, channeled that in a way that made him a leader. But in a sense, that's the right kind of leader, somebody that's not the most perfect of the apostles, Torvalds denial, he ends up coming back.
I was thinking, go back to David with that too. He did a lot of stupid things too. So.
Yeah,
Even to the point of having somebody killed.
yeah.
Um, Yeah, usually, some of the best leaders are those people that have experienced failures, setbacks, trials and tribulations. Nobody has.
And then even Paul realizing he'd made all those mistakes and changing and spent the rest of life basically making up for it too. So.
I think we've had more compassion with those people that would deny Christ or, fall short, whatever.
Well, I appreciate the fact that we went through this, and I think we picked up some tools and some ways of looking at Scripture that's going to help us as we go forward. We're into Isaiah in 2 weeks, and my plan is to look at a little bit of the lay of Israel and the division of the land into the 11 tribes, and then Levites were scattered among the tribes, but then also the division of the kingdom of Judah and Benjamin to the south, and the other 9 tribes, 10 tribes north, and how that sets the ground for Isaiah. And then we'll look at the Advent readings and the application of the readings the churches pick for Advent time from Isaiah. So we'll bring any version of the Bible is just fine, but we may do some popping around a little bit. We might go to the Book of Kings and some of the other things when we do that. I'm going to see if we can have Father make a little pitch too, so that it's not that I don't enjoy your company, but it'd be nice to have 8 or 10 people show up for these things.
Did you know about the timeline? We did the timeline, radical
Yeah,
timeline.
but
Did you know about that, or did you?
I took that when I was at St. Alphonsus, it was with the 9-month course with, I'm blanking on his name, I can see him at the podium.
Jeff Kagan.
Jeff Gibbons and the Biblical Timeline. We actually have still got the DVDs on those. Maybe
24, because they replayed it many times on Sacred Heart Radio, and they played it at midnight, which was,
oh yeah, well, that's great.
but it's not on anymore.
Maybe they didn't
Unfortunately,
have to pay royalties at midnight.
yes.
For those people that are, but I just found it fascinating. There was so much that, growing up, you get snippets of things, but going through that, it sort of brought it together. It made more sense, and how long the time was. There was a long
Yeah,
time.
well, that's what inspired me to put this up. Was in fact, I thought this was one of Caven's products, but it's not. It's the great www.amazingbibleTimeline.com, and I thought it was the same thing as Caven's biblical timeline, but it's not. And it served its purpose for me to be able to see.
This has probably got all the books of the Bible. It was Jeff Kagan's does, just like the historical part.
Well, he picked it as a narrative so that you would start with Genesis and move through, because he says you can't start on page 1 and read straight through the Bible and expect to get the story. Too many people end up confused. So then, after the end of Exodus, or even into Numbers, tells a little bit more of the story, then Joshua enters the Promised Land, then they hop all around the Bible. It's even if we didn't do it here at the parish, if somebody hosted someplace, but we'd be open to hosting it. I couldn't host it myself, but it would help bring people up to speed to where we can do more in depth, so maybe I can talk to Father and see about that, either as we get into Isaiah or after the first of the year, maybe start that up after the first of the year, if somebody wanted to take that on, I think that would be really interesting to do.
It's been done before. Here.
Yeah, but I think we've had, how long, 4 years, 5 years, it's
I can't remember.
every so often, it's nice to bring it back and bring in some new faces that maybe haven't done it, so
When they do
that's sure a great idea.
the two different parts of the Bible, they do the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And after you listen to the Jeff Cavins Bible timeline, then you know who all these people are.
Yeah,
'Cause prior to that, it's like,
I had to read that, it was one of my first gospel readings as deacon. And one of the parishioners outside said, boy, you sound like you've been reading that for 50 years. And I said, well, 45 anyway. Because I had tried to memorize that first chapter of Matthew when I was in high school, so I memorized all his names. And then later on in college, when I read the Bible strips, it was like you said, I recognize this guy, I recognize that guy. Shealtiel shows up with Nehemiah and Ezra to rebuild Jerusalem after Cyrus lets them go back. He's in that. And so many of the others. Characters. Well, let's say our prayer and I'll shut that video off and then we'll be ready for a little break here of 2 weeks and then we'll be back in, what is it, November.
so how far should we read into Isaiah?
There's really no reason to read ahead of time, but you can read, especially number 6, chapter 6, the call of Isaiah. And if you're inspired, you can read 1 through 5 ahead of that. But some of the background work, we'll pick it out as we're going through.
So basically, we're looking for the
So it's November
November
4th, yeah. And then we'll have more focused readings based on the lectionary. And we'll be into year C, starting with the first Sunday of Advent. Okay, our closing prayer is on that last sheet, the one I typed out there. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Jesus,
You are the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in you all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through you and for you. You yourself are before all things, and in you all things hold together. You are the head of your body, the church. You are the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that you might come to have first place in everything. For in you all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through you God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of your cross. By your grace, help us to be faithful disciples, following you with the fidelity of St. Peter and St. Mark. Amen.
in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. They were making a comment, I think on the radio, about why we say amen
Well,
instead of amen. And
even in Hebrew, it's amen, off. And in Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, every language I know, all A's are a pause.
okay.
That's mine.
Yeah, and I don't know where they came up with this amen. That was,
In the choir in college, and the choir director, don't sing amen, amen.
me through it.
And how-
That's the first time.
Well, that's,
I've
yeah, when you
heard
sing
it.
it, it is saying amen. Even here with Greg and, Veronica when she was here, it's amen.
Okay.
That's the way I learned it when I was,
That's
you know,
usually when
a
I
lot
say
younger.